little bit more and maybe going back and hitting more of the fundamentals in terms of, what exactly are some of these foods, that we're saying to eat and why. And so this class is going to go back to some of that basic information. And I tried to make this class basic, but not too basic, if that makes sense. And so, you know me, I'm a huge nerd. And so I love to kind of throw in a little bit of biochemistry here and there. So I've thrown in a little bit of stuff, but hopefully, all of this is at a level that most people will understand. So today we're going to be talking about nutrition basics. And, looks like my pointer. Here we go. Get this going. So, of course, with my food as medicine class, I like to always start with this quote that the food you eat can either be the safest and most powerful form of medicine or the slowest form of poison. And I think this is a great jumping off point because, just kind of keeping in perspective that a lot of what we're eating won't kill us immediately, but yet in the long term, it's not contributing to some of the long-term health goals that most people have. So as with a lot of the classes I teach, I like to have a little bit of a thesis question that we're trying to answer throughout the course of the class. And for this class, a lot of what kind of inspired this content is the question I get all the time from co-learners here at the Reardon Clinic when they ask, what diet is right for me? And when I say diet, not necessarily referring just to a weight loss diet, but more so, what are the foods that I should be eating? And unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to specifically answer this because the reality is there's not a right type of diet for everybody. Each of us are individuals. We have different genetics. We're different ages. We're different races. We come from different parts of the world. And so all of that is going to influence what, the right foods are for us individually. But as a whole, though, there are some basics that are kind of general principles for everybody. And so a lot of that we'll be talking, and hopefully by the time you leave, you'll have somewhat of an idea of what might be right for you specifically. So I'm starting this off with a pop quiz. So those of you who braved the weather and you're here, you're the ones I'm going to pick on today with this. But I want to do a little bit of a pop quiz just to kind of get an idea of what everybody thinks. So the question I'm going to be asking is, I'm going to show you different foods, and I want you to answer which of these foods you consider to be healthy. Okay? So here we go. Number one. This one might be pretty easy. It's a little bit deceiving. Don't let the strawberries fool you. Most people would consider, this isn't, a dessert. And so most people would say probably not the healthiest. Is that accurate? Okay, good. You guys passed number one. Number two, now we're getting into a little bit more tricky. This is a white bread. Right. Most people would probably agree, no, white bread is not the best option for us. Even though grains, still kind of have this stigma as far as, there's certain B vitamins, certain things we need grains for. The reality is when you get bread in this form, it has been so stripped of all the nutrients that it could have potentially had that there's not much left, in terms of nutritional value. One of the things I always say is when you're reading a label, if you see that certain foods have been fortified with nutrients, what that means is they've stripped so many things away from that food that to call it a food, they're having to add nutrients back in. And then you can get into kind of even the broader conversation of the seeds that are being used to grow these foods. And, seeds of wheat, is very different today than what it was 50, 60 years ago. A lot of wheat has been hybridized, so they're selecting for wheat that is a higher yield. But what that means is that wheat has a much higher starch content. And starch makes wheat, a lot more of what's considered a high glycemic food. So I'm going to make this a little bit trickier. What about this bread? So this is whole wheat bread. Any better than the white bread? Depends, yeah. Maybe a little bit, and that's it's actually an accurate statement. It depends on the, the source of the seed for this bread. But in reality, in terms of what we're going to talk about, the wheat bread is not much of a step up from the white bread. And as I mentioned, both of these in the body, glycemically are about the equivalent of eating sugar in terms of what they do to your blood sugar. And like I said, a lot of this is how the wheat is grown. A lot of it is the starch content of the wheat, but wheat today is a very high glycemic food. And so the small nutritional value you might get, from the little bit of, grains in the whole grain bread doesn't outweigh the effect it's going to have on your blood sugar. And so as a general rule, I would say probably for the most part, neither of these are the healthiest foods to be eating. And then we'll be talking about, in later classes, we'll be talking about additives and preservatives and pesticides. And so then when you go one more layer deeper and you look at all the different pesticides and herbicides they're spraying on wheat, that adds a whole other layer of complexity that makes wheat even more detrimental for us. Okay. How about this? Salad. Any thoughts? Healthy? Yes? No? Maybe so? It depends. So let me make it a little bit easier. Which one would be better? Number 2, exactly. And so, this is the trap that a lot of people fall into is so full disclosure, my daughter plays soccer and, she has lost most of her games this season. And so, but they tied their last game. So we decided to go for ice cream and we went to Wendy's and I hadn't eaten dinner. And so they had this salad that had, avocado on it and it had chicken and it had some cheese, and I thought, okay, that's not a bad option. So I got this salad and I ate it, and it was probably the most unsatisfying salad I think I've had in a long time. And a lot of it was a lot of iceberg lettuce. It was tomatoes that had no flavor. It was avocado that was browning. So, so really the quality of the ingredients that are used really make a big difference in terms of the nutritional value. So I would say this is not an unhealthy choice by any means, but, using some of the more iceberg romaine lettuce doesn't quite have the nutritional value. It's got, of course, the croutons and the dressing. And so all of that make it not quite as healthy of a choice as, say, your colorful salad here. And so, but I would say this is a better choice than, a hamburger and French fries. Okay, what about this? What about eggs? Healthy? Yes. When most people agree. So eggs are kind of finally coming back in. Eggs had a bad run there for a while. A lot of people were concerned about the cholesterol in eggs. And cholesterol even in and of itself could be a whole lecture conversation. But just suffice to say that eggs are actually a really great source of protein. Don't be afraid of them for the cholesterol. 80% of cholesterol in your body is actually made by the liver. So really only about 20% of your total cholesterol number comes from the foods that you're eating. And, I would say if you're concerned about cholesterol, go back on our YouTube channel. We have an excellent lecture by Dr. Jennifer Jackson where she talks about all the research that was used to kind of propagate this idea that cholesterol is bad in terms of heart disease, and she actually debunks a lot of it. And so cholesterol is not the enemy that we typically think it is. And so in that regard, eggs are one of the best sources of protein you can get. Eggs are also high in something called choline, which is great for memory. Now, what about this? Any difference between the white eggs and the brown eggs? Nope, you can't judge an egg by its shell because unfortunately the brown eggs don't nutritionally hold any more value than the white eggs. Now, however, eggs are one of those foods that there is a lot of marketing, around. And so what is the right type? And, the best way to do it is if you, of course, had your own chicken that you knew what you were feeding it that lived, on your farm. Or if you got eggs from a farmer that is letting them run in the pasture. But if you're buying your eggs at the grocery store, the best eggs to buy are the ones that are pasture raised eggs. Cage-free eggs, all that means is that they've actually opened the door. Doesn't mean the chickens have gone anywhere, so they've just given them the option, for a little bit of time per day to go outside. Doesn't mean that they actually did go outside in the pasture. And even organic eggs, all to be classified as organic, all you need is to feed your chickens organic feed. So it could be organic corn, so it may or may not, it's probably a better choice than the regular eggs, but still your pasture raised eggs are your best option. And kind of the two little things that, little hacks I tell people to look for in terms of good quality eggs is number one, when you go to crack your egg, see how hard it is to crack the shell. Because the chickens that have a better mineral source, it's going to be harder to crack the shell. It's going to be a harder shell versus chickens that are not fed a healthy diet that you crack that shell and it just kind of disintegrates. And then the second thing to look for is the color of the yolk. So the yolk of an egg, the ones that have been fed a really good phytonutrient, omega-rich diet, the yolk is going to almost be an orange color. It's going to be darker and it's going to be orangey versus the chickens that are fed a poor quality diet, that yolk's going to be kind of a pale yellow. And so those are two little things to look for. But as a whole, I would say unless eggs are an allergy trigger for you, eggs are a healthy choice, a great choice. What about this? Steak. Good? Bad? American Heart Association would say probably not, but any thoughts? It's lean. This one is lean. That is correct. And so this is, steak is one that I would say, again, barring any moral, opposition to meat, steak is actually, if it's a good quality, is not a bad option. Again, it goes back to what the cow was eating. If anybody has read the book, The Plant Paradox, Dr. Stephen Gundry says in there that you are what you ate. So what that cow is eating is what gets into the protein, what gets into the fat. And so when we eat red meat, that's what we get exposed to. You can actually look at the fat of cows that have been pasture raised and pasture finished, and their fat is high in omega-3 fatty acids versus omega-3s. Versus omega-6s, I'm sorry. Omega-3s are anti-inflammatory. Omega-6s are pro-inflammatory. So the cows that are fed a corn-based diet are going to be more inflamed, and the fat of those cows is going to be much higher in the pro-inflammatory omega-6. So this is one of those, it does depend, and I do encourage people to choose quality over quantity. We probably don't need to be eating a steak every night, for dinner. We probably don't even need to be eating meat every day. And so, but as you choose quality, which is more expensive, that typically tends to limit quantity for most people. So, okay, well, quiz is over. So we'll kind of jump on in, Nutrition 101. And I kind of want to start this off, again, why is it that we actually eat food? Apart from the fact that we enjoy it, it tastes good, it's part of our traditions, it's a way to bring people together, at a very basic level, the reason we eat food is for energy. And the reason that's important to note is as we start going through the different types of foods, what you need to understand is that each of the different types of sources of food provide a different source of fuel for the body. Historically, it's always been, calories in, calories out. If you want to lose weight, you eat less calories, so you have less coming in, and you exercise, so you have more calories going out. When you have a deficit, you lose weight. But as 95% of dieters who fail will tell you, that doesn't usually work. And it's usually not something that's sustainable. And so really, when we start to have an understanding of what these different types of calories do in the body from these different food sources, you can have a better idea of how you can use food in terms of the goals you have for your own nutrition. So, a lot of what is best for each of us is based on our genetics. It's based on our nutritional needs, and it's based on our lifestyle, so how active we are. So all of those are factors that play into figuring out what foods are right for us. So as I said, the main reason we eat food is for energy, and the currency of how we measure energy is calories. So in kind of basic terms, if you were to eat 1 gram of carbohydrates, that'll give you 4 calories. 1 gram of protein will also give you 4 calories. 1 gram of alcohol will give you 7 calories, and 1 gram of fat will give you 9 calories. Now, again, the way that these calories work in the body is very different, so when you're looking for the right types of foods, the best foods are not only going to just provide you with calories, but they're also going to provide you with nutritional value. So I'll give you an example. This is a food that has 0 grams of fat, 0 grams of protein, and approximately 36 grams of total carbohydrates. So if you were to use the math I gave you and you multiply 36 times 4, you'll get approximately 140, give or take, 140 calories. So that's how they come up with this total calories number, is based on how many grams of protein, carbohydrates, and fat are in this. Now, when you look at this, even though this provides 140 calories to the body, there isn't a lot of nutritional value, that this food provides. And so once your body burns through these calories, you're probably going to want to go back for more. So as I mentioned, the different types of calories behave differently in the body. And the reason they behave differently is there's different rates, different speeds at which these calories are broken down. I think a lot of people, it's intuitive to think that, fat is going to break down a lot slower than, say, something like sugar, or carbohydrates. There's different mechanisms of breakdown. So we're going to talk about where in the body we actually break down these calories. So for instance, carbohydrates, you actually start digesting carbohydrates in your mouth. So by the time that those carbohydrates get to your stomach, not only have you enzymatically broken them down, but you've also chewed, so you've mechanically broken them down. So by the time they get to the stomach and then in the small intestine, they are ready for absorption, versus your fats and proteins are more primarily digested in the stomach. And so that influences, how quickly those calories get absorbed. I always tell people, kind of a funny sidebar, has anybody ever heard of the saltine cracker challenge? Any boys in high school? So the saltine cracker challenge is you challenge somebody to put 10 saltine crackers in your mouth. And it's the funny thing to watch your friend to do it, because when they try and chew it up and break it down, they can't do it. You don't have enough saliva and you don't have enough enzymes. So inevitably what happens is they start choking and spitting and crackers come out everywhere and everybody laughs, But that's an example of, these enzymes in your mouth that help you break down carbohydrates. That's how we get our food nice and soft, and then we're able to swallow it. So different types of calories are used differently for metabolism. So for instance, carbohydrates are burned very quickly. Fats and proteins are burned a little bit more slowly. And so, so how our metabolism and how our body uses these calories is different. And then another major thing we're going to talk about is different types of calories signal hormones differently. And if anybody's goal in here is weight loss, I'm telling you the secret to weight loss is not counting your calories, but it's looking at your hormones, because hormones are going to better regulate whether you're burning fat or storing fat. And so we'll talk about that here in just a little bit too. And so, but the different types of foods will signal these hormones differently in the body. All right, so kind of jumping in, we're going to start with carbohydrates. And, carbohydrates are a preferred energy source in the body. Again, this is why carbs are comfort food. This is why they taste so good. This is why we love sugar. I mean, you can give a baby sugar and they're going to love it and lap it up, because at the very primitive parts of our brain, we know that sugar is very quick energy, and we love that. Our body loves that. Even so, I see a lot of kids in my practice, and a lot of kids come in on a very carbohydrate-rich diet. So they're eating, they'll eat only 10 foods, and of those 10 foods, it's crackers, it's yogurt, it's, sweet potatoes, it's pizza, it's macaroni and cheese. And intuitively, those kids are gravitating toward those foods because they're easier to digest. A lot of these kids have a lot of digestive issues, and as you start to fix those digestive issues, intuitively, they're more open to eating more fibrous vegetables and proteins and fats that are a bit harder to digest. But when your digestion is off and your energy is low, carbohydrates are the easiest thing to go for. And so, and that's, like I said, they're a quick energy and they're easier. Most of them are easier to digest compared to fats and proteins. In nature, if you go way back, to our hunter-gatherer, most carbohydrates are more scarce. In terms of, probably the best source of carbohydrates in nature are fruits. And fruits are only available certain times of the year. And if you think, kind of back in caveman time, fruits are available toward the end of summer. You eat a lot of fruits. That helps put on a lot of fat. That helps sustain them over the wintertime. And so in that way, carbohydrates signal fat gain. And so I know a lot of people are programmed to think that fat causes you to gain fat, but it's not fat. Carbohydrates hormonally signal you to store fat. And we'll talk about that here in just a sec. And then the reason actually they signal fat storage is based on insulin. Insulin is the hormone that signals the body to store more fat rather than burn it. So some of the probably best known carbohydrates, are grains, wheat, rice, oats, corn, fruit, like I mentioned, is probably one of the most readily available. Even some of our starchy vegetables, our root vegetables that grow underground, these tend to be higher in carbohydrates. Now, as a lot of people kind of intuitively know, there's a difference between these carbohydrates and say something like a Snickers bar, because, these carbohydrates that we get from vegetables, even the starchy vegetables, they're what we consider complex carbohydrates. Has anybody heard that term before? There's simple carbohydrates and there's complex carbohydrates. And that has to do with how quickly the body breaks down those carbohydrates. So as I mentioned, carbohydrates are primarily digested. They start being digested in the mouth with an amylase enzyme. And then mechanically chewing will break those down. And then carbohydrates, further kind of get churned in the stomach. But once they leave the stomach, the pancreas, which is hidden back here behind the stomach, also releases more digestive enzymes. So you have more amylase, you have, more enzymes that will kind of enzymatically break down these carbohydrates so that as food moves through the small intestine, you can absorb those carbohydrates pretty quickly. Now, there is a difference, as I mentioned, between the simple carbohydrates and the complex. So simple carbohydrates would be stuff like this, like glucose and fructose. Has everybody heard of those before? Essentially, if you were to eat white sugar is 50% glucose and 50% fructose. And so these monosaccharides can be absorbed, and this is what the body uses for energy. Now, disaccharides, these are some like sucrose, lactose. Does anybody recognize that from milk? Lactose, maltose. These disaccharides are essentially two of the mono hooked together. I think I actually have a picture of this. So these are the monosaccharides. So a disaccharide is just two of these hooked together. So this is basically table sugar. So when you eat sugar, essentially all the body has to do is break one bond and boom, you've got energy. You've got glucose. Your body's happy. Your brain is humming. Your brain loves glucose. And so in that regard, those are a very quick source of energy. These are a simple carbohydrate. It's very simply one bond broken to access the energy. When you get a little bit more complex, say in something like a polysaccharide, so like a starch, so these are your complex carbohydrates. You see how many bonds there are to break, and then this will just kind of keep going on repeating, for, 15, 20 different iterations. So to access the energy from this sweet potato, for instance, it's not just one bond broken, it's multiple bonds that have to be broken to access that energy. And so that slows down the release of energy, over time. So it slows down how quickly that sugar gets into your bloodstream. Does that make sense? It's kind of the difference between, say a white potato and a sweet potato. Sweet potato is a bit of a more complex carbohydrate. So that's not going to spike your blood sugar, say, as much as having a white potato, which is broken down a lot faster, and that will spike your blood sugar a lot more. Now, there are certain also types of carbohydrates that cannot be broken down. So those would be considered our fibers. And fibers play a really important role because the body can't break them down. They just kind of travel through the digestive tract, unabsorbed, unbroken down. And so in that regard, I kind of rethink of fiber like a scrubber brush. So as it's moving through the digestive tract, undigested, it's kind of pushing things along. Our liver dumps a lot of waste into the gut. And so fiber is there to kind of bind it up and move it along and eliminate it from the body. And also certain types of fiber can actually be used for energy by the bacteria. So we can't access the energy in this fiber, but the bacteria in our colon can ferment this fiber and use that for energy, for the large intestine. That's what we consider prebiotic fiber. If anybody has heard that term before, it's the fiber that's in food that our bacteria can use for energy. So a lot of your cruciferous vegetables, Jerusalem artichoke, a lot of those plantains have this inulin fiber that the body, the bacteria in the colon can use for energy. All right, so how do carbs hormonally signal in the body? Because as I mentioned, each of the different types of foods signal our hormones differently. And so carbohydrates signal a particular hormone in the body called insulin. And, a lot of people have heard of insulin in the context of diabetes. And, type 1 diabetes is where your body doesn't make insulin. Your pancreas doesn't make insulin. Type 2 diabetes is where your body stops using insulin. And so insulin is best known for helping our body grab a hold of sugar that's in the blood and put it in our cells. So I just want to kind of take a step back for a second and just talk about how amazing this whole process is. If you start with, say for instance, an apple, not only do we mechanically break that down, then we enzymatically break that down, then it gets in our stomach, and then we chemically break it down with the acid. And then once we get this food down into the smallest component part we can get it, then we absorb it across the lining of our small intestine into our bloodstream. But that's not the end of the story. Once that sugar is in our bloodstream, now we have to get that sugar into the cell where it can be turned into energy. So does anybody know what is the organelle in our cell that generates energy? The mitochondria, yes. Dr. Ron would be so proud. He is big on the mitochondria. And so insulin's job is to get that sugar from the bloodstream into the cell. Without insulin, I actually have a good picture of this. Without insulin, we can't get it into the cell. So if this is our cell right here, and this cell could be any cell in the body. It could be your muscle cells, your brain cells, your skin cells, you name it. All of these cells, to get this glucose, which is floating around in the bloodstream, to get this glucose into the cell where that mitochondria is, you need this key, this insulin key, to fit into that receptor and unlock that receptor site so that then glucose can get into the cell. So that's why when insulin isn't working properly, your glucose can't get into the cell. So number one, you're tired, so you don't have energy. And then number two, this glucose starts to build up in the bloodstream, and that's what we consider, a high blood sugar. So somebody who's diabetic or pre-diabetic has a fasting blood sugar of around a 100 to 120. And what that means is they've just got all this glucose that's building up, and it can't go anywhere. Your body can't use it for energy. And a lot of times it's the dysregulation of insulin, that makes, that glucose difficult, to get to where it needs to go. Now, the bigger question is, why is insulin, dysregulated? And so it goes back to insulin is signaled by carbohydrates. Fats do not signal an insulin response, and in an appreciable sort of way, proteins don't quite as much either, not quite as quickly as carbohydrates. And so now it's necessary to signal this insulin when we eat carbohydrates, because as I just mentioned, you need it to get it into the cell. But what's happening for a lot of people that are eating a lot of simple carbohydrates, those easy to break down carbohydrates, is those sugars are getting into the bloodstream and flooding it so quickly that the body kind of goes into panic mode and it dumps a ton of insulin. So you get this huge spike of insulin. And so, when you're young, and your body's healthy, your body can handle that spike of insulin and bring it down, and you're probably okay. But over time, it's almost kind of like the boy that cried wolf. The more you spike that insulin really, really high, your cell signaling is going to start to break down, and you're not going to respond to that insulin as well. And so that's where your blood sugar over time, eating a high carbohydrate diet, especially simple carbohydrate diet, over time is going to create issues with that insulin signaling. Now, this is really, really important. This is something that most people don't know, that not only does insulin help us utilize carbohydrates and sugar for energy, glucose, but insulin is also a signaling molecule, and it communicates with our fat cells. And so when insulin levels are really high, what that's signaling to our fat cells is to build bigger, to store energy, which intuitively this makes sense, because if you go back thousands of years to our ancestors, as I mentioned, they didn't have a lot of access to foods that would spike their insulin. And when they did have access to those foods, it was to their advantage to store away the excess as fat. So what's happening for us today is we're eating all these foods that are signaling this elevated insulin response, and it's signaling just fat storage in the body. And that's why a lot of people get into that cycle of obesity. Now, one thing to note also, if for anybody who's wanting to lose weight, on a diet, as I mentioned in the beginning, a lot of diets are, the calorie in, calorie out model. So the first thing they'll tell you is restrict your calories, increase your exercise. But what a lot of dietitians don't tell people is the quality of the calories you're eating are what's going to hormonally signal whether or not you're going to lose weight. So there's actually a really great documentary on Netflix that just, illustrates this perfectly. It's called Fed Up. If anybody hasn't seen it, I highly recommend it. And in this video, they profile kids. These are kids under the age of 16 that are obese, morbidly obese. And what these kids are doing is they're seeing a nutritionist that's having them eat, cereal for breakfast, so Cheerios, kind of a high carbohydrate, low fat milk for breakfast. They're packing their little pre-measured out baggies of pretzels for their snack. Lunch is an iceberg salad with fat-free dressing, so these kids are put on this calorie restricted diet, but it's still a diet that's signaling that insulin response. So not only are they not losing fat, but they're miserable, they're hungry, they're not getting any energy that their body needs. And so as you watch this video, these kids, eventually will fail because they don't, they're hungry. Their bodies are signaling that they're hungry. And so, but to really signal the body to start burning fat, you've got to bring those insulin levels down. And so as a little sidebar, like I said, this is a little outside the scope of this class, but I tell people there's 3 ways to bring insulin down, and that's a low carb, higher fat diet, so essentially a ketogenic diet, through got a blood sugar issue. And just getting them on a high protein, high fat breakfast, snack, and lunch can change their entire outlook on the day. All right, so moving on from carbohydrates. Does anybody have any questions about carbohydrates before I move on? Does any of this not make sense? Okay, all right, so moving on then, we're going to start talking about fats. Now, fats, similar to carbohydrates, are a preferred energy source. That's why everybody loves bacon, right? You know, we are, again, in the same way that we are biochemically kind of, programmed to enjoy sugar, we also really enjoy fats. And, if you go back to our calorie chart, the reason we like fats is fats are a great source of energy. For 1 gram of fat, we get 9 calories of energy, which for our ancestors that didn't have the access to food that we have, that was major, to have access to that amount of calories. And so fats are a slower burn energy, so whereas the sugars, it's one bond broken and boom, we've got energy. The fats, it's a slower burn energy because fats, the type of fats that help us get energy are what are called ketones. And that's what the body uses for energy. Fats are harder to digest compared to sugars. We need digestive enzymes in bile. Anybody know where bile comes from? The gallbladder, yeah. So how many people know somebody that's had their gallbladder taken out? So fats, everything in moderation, so you don't want to overdo any one of these categories, but fats as a whole are a bit harder to digest. And then fats do not trigger an insulin response in the body. That is the power. If anybody has followed the ketogenic diet that's popular these days, the power of the ketogenic diet is that when you eat a larger percentage of your diet, which the ketogenic diet is anywhere between about 60 and 80% of calories from fat. When you eat a higher percentage of your calories from fat, you're giving your body energy so you don't feel lethargic, but it's an energy source that does not trigger insulin. So because of that, when you're eating ketogenic, you're still signaling for your body to burn stored fat, and you're also not as hungry because your blood sugar is not going up and down. So in that way, fats are a great source of energy. Now, as I mentioned, carbohydrates are broken down in the mouth and, from enzymes that are released from the pancreas. Fats are primarily, digested in the stomach from the stomach acid, but then also we've got certain fats that are released from the pancreas, like lipase, that help break those fats down. And then also, as I mentioned, here's the gallbladder. The gallbladder dumps in bile to help emulsify fat. So emulsifying fat means you kind of help integrate it better. When for instance, if you have milk, that you get straight from the cow, how the fat is separate from the rest of it, but then you go to the store and they've homogenized it. That's more of an emulsified form of fat. And so that's kind of what the bile is doing, is helping to emulsify that fat and help with absorption of it. If you've ever had, sorry for the gross before lunch, poop talk, but if you've ever had bowels that float, chances are they're high in fats, which means you're probably not digesting your fats very well. Or if you've ever had bowels that kind of skid, kind of leave a fatty streak on the bottom, that means you're probably not digesting your fats very well. And so a lot of that, like I said, if you're not digesting them very well, you're probably not absorbing them very well either. All right, so there's also different types of fats, and kind of like carbohydrates, we have to break down the fats that we get in our diet to be able to absorb them. So some of the types of fats you've heard of are saturated fats, unsaturated fats, polyunsaturated fats. Again, these have different kind of molecular shapes. It's the difference between a few different double bonds here. That's what changes the shape of these fats. Kind of to help distinguish them, your saturated fats are the ones that are solid at room temperature. So butter is a saturated fat. Your Crisco, even coconut oil. Coconut oil is primarily a saturated fat. Your unsaturated fats are liquid at room temperature. So these are your vegetable oils primarily. And then your polyunsaturated, these are also liquid at room temperature. And these tend to be some of your better, higher omega-3, omega-9 oils like olive oil, avocado oil, walnut oil, some of those. And so now one thing that this gets a little bit confusing for people, but each of these different types of fats contain what are called essential fatty acids, which the probably best known essential fatty acid that people have heard about is omega-3 fatty acid. And fatty acids are essentially what you get when you break down these fats. And so there are omega-3s in, there are potentially omega-3s in each of these different types of fats. But the fatty acids are what you get when you break it down. So, omega-3s primarily are in fish oil. Certain plants are high in omega-3s like walnuts and flax and hemp and hemp seeds. Primarily your vegetable oils are highest in omega-6s. And omega-9s are highest in, say, stuff like coconut oil and avocado oil. Now, one thing to note is all of these, all omega-3s, 6s, and 9s, all of those are essential. So all of these our body needs, and all of them we have to get in our diet. We cannot, manufacture any of these fatty acids in our body. But primarily, as a whole, your omega-3 fatty acids are going to be more anti-inflammatory, so they're going to be putting out fires in the body, versus your omega-6s tend to be more pro-inflammatory, so these tend to be creating more fires in the body. And most people, because of the diet that we eat and the fats that we're eating, most people have a lot more omega-6s compared to omega-3s, because a lot of omega-6s, like I mentioned, are in vegetable oils, and those are the oils that are used a lot in processed foods. So when you flip over the bag of Lay's potato chips and it's been cooked in safflower oil or cottonseed oil or soybean oil, those are omega-6 rich oils. And the reason they use those oils is because they're cheap and because they last a long time on the shelf. Now, the other way that food companies have kind of changed fats to make them more shelf stable is they've heated those fats. And does anybody know what happens when you heat some of these fats? What do you get? High heat fats. And what happens is you break some of these bonds, and that's how you get a trans fat. So trans fatty acids are the fats that have been associated with cancer. They have carcinogenic effects. And like I said, those do not exist in nature, primarily, the ones that they're putting in our foods. And so those trans fats, our body doesn't quite know what to do with. And so that's why they tend to have more of an inflammatory and carcinogenic effect, because the body doesn't recognize them in the same way that it recognizes some of these other fats that you would see in nature. So kind of the way to look at this is, plant-based fats are going to be your best source of fat. So your nuts and seeds, they're going to have a combination of both omega-6s and omega-3s. If anybody's attended my food as medicine class, the number one rule of nutrition I tell people is to just eat real food. And if you're eating real food, that's going to cover a whole lot of nutritional sins that you could commit. And so how you would define a real food is if you took a food back, 2,000 years ago, and they recognized what it was, it's a real food. But a lot of food has been manufactured in modern times. And so as soon as we start messing with it and tweaking it, that's when we start messing things up. And so your best source of good quality fats come from, the plant-based fats that you find in nature. And in nature, these fats are very often paired with fiber. So a lot of your nuts are also a good source of fiber. And these nuts and seeds tend to have both omega-3s and omega-6s. So there's typically a balance of both. In some sort of nuts, like for instance, almonds do skew higher in omega-6s, but something like walnuts and flaxseed tend to skew higher in omega-3s. And so, but if you're eating a variety of real food, you're going to get a natural balance of a lot of those fats. Now, avocados, I've seen this T-shirt. It says, you can't fix everything. You're not an avocado. And so an avocado is a great source of plant-based fats. Avocados are higher in omega-9s, which is a great anti-inflammatory omega. And it's just a great source of energy. And, what's interesting is, I use my kids as guinea pigs a lot. And, with kids especially, kids fall victim to, what parents feed them. And, carbohydrates, again, they taste good. They're easy to break down. So kids tend to gravitate toward carbohydrates. But what I typically encourage parents to do, that if you're pulling back on carbohydrates, start giving your kids lots of good fats and see what happens. And with my kids, they'll each sit and eat an entire avocado by themselves. We'll put a lot of good coconut oil on vegetables and roast it, and they'll eat just about any vegetable that's roasted and we have sea salt on. And so you add good fats and you're stimulating that other, preferred energy source for kids. And so they'll eat a lot of these really good whole foods, that are high in fats, and they'll choose those over the carbohydrates. So these are a lot of the oils, so you've got your olive oil, your, looks like walnut oil, the flaxseed oil, all of these natural oils are great sources of these essential fatty acids. The only, kind of caveat, with the oils, because these are extracted from the foods, the extraction method does make a difference in the quality of the oil. So for instance, if it's not a cold press olive oil, what can happen is when they're pressing that, if it's generating too much heat, that can degrade the quality of the oil. So really the extraction method for these oils is really important in terms of the nutritional value you get from them. As I mentioned, coconut oil is all the rage in terms of eating it, putting on your skin, everything. It's great for just about everything. And then these are some of the other great sources of fats. So of course, the good quality meat, like I mentioned, the pasture raised meat, the wild caught salmon, the pasture raised eggs, the good quality raw, cheese, all of that can be really great sources of fats in the diet. And then, of course, butter. Butter, kind of like eggs, butter's back, for anybody who's still doing margarine. Butter's back, but again, butter, kind of like with all these other animal-based sources, you do have to be aware of what the cow was fed, because that's going to influence what's in the fat of the butter. And so one of my favorite butters to recommend is one called Kerrygold. If you haven't made the switch, once you go to Kerrygold butter, you won't ever go back to regular butter because it tastes so much better. Kind of like with the eggs, it's a richer yellow color because it's got more of the nutrients in it, and it's a butter that's from cows that are completely pasture raised. It's shipped in from Ireland. You can find it though at Costco and Dillon's and Sam's, just about everywhere now. So the fats that we want to avoid in our diet, as I mentioned, are the fats that are heated up really high, because these fats, as you start to heat these fats, you start breaking these bonds and you create trans fats, you create hydrogenated fats or partially hydrogenated fats, all of these different fats that are bad for us, are creating that carcinogenic effect in the body. Yeah, question. Yeah.
Fish or eggs?
Yeah.
You're heating that up?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the question was, if you're heating up certain foods, is it bad? So frying as a cooking technique is not necessarily a bad thing. You just want to make sure you're using the appropriate oil for the temperature you're cooking at. So if you're roasting or you're heating high or you're grilling, you want to use your stable oils. So your saturated oils tend to be more heat stable. So coconut oil and butter tend to be two really good high heat stable oils. olive oil is not a good high heat stable oil. In fact, if you heat olive oil too high, it can turn into a trans fat, just like some of these other vegetable oils.
So you can buy though, and what, like olive oil, they'll say for marinade.
Uh-huh.
They'll say olive oil for stir fry.
Yeah. Yeah, so the question for our online audience was if you buy kind of the pre-made oils for stir fry or marinades, it's still going to degrade the quality of the oil. And so olive oil is best drizzled on after you've cooked it, or if you're cooking kind of low heat sauteing, that's the best way to use those oils. If you want an oil for marinades, avocado oil is a higher heat stable oil that's liquid. You can also buy the MCT oil, which is coconut oil that is liquid, at room temperature. So that's easier to marinate versus some of the other ones that will harden up, if you were to put your marinating meat in the refrigerator. So yeah, I mean, you can do it. Like I said, you're just going to degrade the quality of your oil when you cook it. So, yeah. So like I said, the fried foods, that's what makes these particular fried foods bad, is that it's the oil you're cooking in. If you were to fry something at home in coconut oil, the frying technique in and of itself is not terrible. I mean, you will, of course, if you're frying foods, you will, like for vegetables, break down some of the nutrients in it. But what inherently makes a lot of this frying technique bad is the oils that they're using to fry them in. And so a better quality oil doesn't necessarily make the cooking technique of frying bad. It's just what you're using. I've actually been told, kind of as a sidebar for anybody who lives in Wichita, that the Nifty Nut House now offers nuts that are roasted in coconut oil, which is fantastic because most of the time when you buy roasted nuts at the store, they're roasted in soybean oil or cottonseed oil, all these omega-6 rich oils. But I used to tell people just get the raw nuts and then roast it yourself in coconut oil. But now apparently Nifty Nut House offers coconut oil roasted nuts. So I'm not being paid by them, just a little sidebar. I like to pass on good info when I get it. So yeah, all these fried foods are, and these oils are what inherently make a lot of these fried foods bad for us. And it's pro-inflammatory. And inflammation in the body is kind of like, speeding up wear and tear of the inside of your body faster than what you should be. So hormonal signaling of fats. So fats do not signal insulin, do not signal an insulin response. And so, so when you eat a higher fat meal, as I mentioned, your body can break that down and use it for energy, but it's not going to stimulate insulin. So fats as ketones get used for energy over a longer period of time, so you stay full longer also. And then the other benefit is that low insulin signals fat burning. And, the major benefit of being in a low insulin state is that when you run out of fats in your diet, let's say you had an avocado for breakfast, your body can burn that avocado, burn that fat for energy. But when you run out, because your insulin levels are low and your body's already signaling fat burning, if you don't have time to eat lunch, or you don't have access to food right that second, rather than your blood sugar tanking, you going into this hangry, lightheaded, shaky, irritable state, your body just naturally transitions into pulling stored fat, and it continues to burn that fat for energy for as long as it needs to until you give it food again. I mean, there are people that are fasting, for 7 up to 30 days at a time. And the reason they can do that is we carry this storage vessel full of energy around with us. Most people just can't access it because their insulin levels are so high. And so when you're eating a higher amount of good quality fats and your insulin levels stay low, that will signal fat burning. So this is just a little bit of a diagram, to show you the mitochondria. As I mentioned, not to get too deep into all of this, but this is the mitochondria inside the cell. The other major benefit of burning fats, as ketones, is to burn those for energy. There's 3 steps that need to be made, to really take it through these it's called the TCA cycle or the Krebs cycle, basically just to turn it into energy, versus glucose has more steps to get there. So you're going to use more nutrients, you're going to use more B vitamins, more minerals, to turn that glucose into energy versus using those ketones for energy. And so, the analogy I give with burning fats versus burning sugars is I tell people our bodies were made kind of like a hybrid car, and with a hybrid car, you have the battery, but you also have gas, and there's appropriate times to use each. The gas is really good if you're driving on the highway and you need to go really fast, or if you slam on the gas and you need to speed up really quickly, that's when that car will burn the gas for quick, long, sustained energy, versus it will kick into the battery, when you're at a more kind of gradual pace driving around town. Now, in that model, when you run out of gasoline, what do you have to do? If you can't get to that battery, you have to stop and fill up. So if you're primarily eating a carbohydrate, sugar-rich diet, you're always burning the gas. So even though you've got this battery full of energy, you're only ever burning gas. And every time you run out of gas, you have to stop and fill up. Whereas when you train your body to burn fats for fuel, what that's like is being able to switch into using your battery, and burning stored fat is kind of like burning the battery, that as we kind of drive around town and we need, that more sustained energy, you can tap into that battery and burn those fats as your primary fuel source. And, it's good to be able to switch back and forth. And, what we call that is metabolic flexibility. So you don't want to just always only ever eat fat and not ever eat carbohydrates, but you want the ability to switch between the two. But most people, because our culture is so much surrounded, eating all these simple carbohydrates, it's like our body forgets how to tap into that battery, how to tap into that stored fuel. And so all we ever do is burn the gas and store the excess, as energy. And the other the next, kind of way you can take this analogy, and that's what this diagram is showing, is that when you burn gasoline, the other thing is you're creating a lot of exhaust, there's a waste byproduct, versus using the battery, there's less of a waste byproduct. Your body is more efficient at burning that as a fuel. And so, in that way, you can utilize the ketogenic diet to reduce inflammation, and to kind of reduce an oxidative burden that the body has from eating a lot of carbohydrates. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay. All right. So moving on to our last fuel source is proteins. Now, proteins compared to fats and compared to carbohydrates are not our preferred energy source. This is why when most people go on a diet and they restrict carbohydrates and they restrict fats, they're miserable because all they're eating is protein. And protein is not typically, we can use it for energy, but it's not our preferred source of energy. Proteins, we primarily want to use for repair in the body. So proteins get broken down into what are called amino acids, which you've probably heard of some of the more common amino acids. There's certain amino acids like glutamine. If you've ever done a gut repair program, most gut repair programs have glutamine in it because glutamine is a great amino acid for repairing the gut. Tryptophan. Anybody, heard of, after your turkey dinner, you get sleepy. Turkey's high in tryptophan. Tryptophan is used in the body to build serotonin, which is used to also build melatonin. You use an amino acid called tyrosine to make dopamine in the body. And so these amino acids are critically important for kind of being the building blocks that our body needs to repair and to build all the different hormones, and signaling molecules that the body needs. We have two actually different types of amino acids. We have certain amino acids that are called essential amino acids, and these are amino acids we have to get in the diet versus there are non-essential amino acids. These are amino acids that the body can actually make, from other byproducts. And so these essential amino acids, what's interesting is culturally, a lot of times cultures will combine different foods to get what we call a complete protein. And so a complete protein is essentially a food that has all of the essential amino acids in it. So historically, beans and rice are paired together. So individually, each of them have certain amino acids, but individually, they don't cover all of the essential amino acids. But when you pair them together, that is now a complete protein because it has all the essential amino acids. That's one of the benefits of eating quinoa. If you've never tried quinoa, it's technically actually not a grain. Quinoa is actually a seed, but it is considered a complete protein because it contains all of the essential amino acids. And so, so getting enough of these proteins is critically important for our body being able to repair itself. Now, interestingly enough, this is one of my favorite things to talk about because I see this all the time in patients. Where proteins are primarily digested is in the stomach. Now, you also have, certain enzymes that the pancreas releases that will further break down proteins, but proteins are primarily broken down by the hydrochloric acid in the stomach. And the reason I'm such a big stickler on this is that 10% of our population is on acid blockers because the symptom of reflux is so incredibly prevalent, throughout our culture. But I also, with all of the kind of more recent press that those acid blockers have gotten, I have patients in droves taking themselves off those acid blockers because they've been associated with Alzheimer's and dementia. And when you look mechanistically, it makes complete sense because the acid in your stomach, when it breaks down these proteins, it breaks them down into those amino acids. Well, those amino acids are the building blocks of our neurotransmitters. And what does your brain need to survive and thrive? Are these your neurotransmitters? And so now the question then is, kind of as a little bit of a sidebar that people ask is, well, why do people have reflux? Why is this so common and so prevalent? And interestingly enough, for most people, it's they actually have too little acid in the stomach. And not to beat a dead horse, but probably one of the most significant ways we suppress acid in the stomach is by eating too many grains. So grains that are high in lectins, grains like corn, grains like wheat, those also contain a protein that blocks stomach acid. It's called antitrypsin protein. And so, what's interesting is this isn't just happening in humans. In cows, so cows, half of the world's calcium carbonate, which is essentially like taking a Tums, it's a buffering agent. Half of the world's calcium carbonate is put into the feed of cows preventatively because they know that the corn causes reflux. And when the corn causes reflux in the cows stop eating. And so when cows stop eating, that's not good for the farmers trying to get them to gain weight and trying to sell them, per pound at market. And so, so they just preventatively put this calcium carbonate in their feed to prevent the symptom of reflux in cows. And so most people that are having reflux, it's because they're eating too many grains. And it's because they are suppressing their stomach acid. And so when you suppress stomach acid, the brain sends a signal, when the stomach fills up, as it starts to stretch and as it fills up and as the acid gets released in the stomach, the brain sends a signal to close off the esophagus right here so that as the stomach starts churning, all the contents of the stomach stay in the stomach. And so if there's not enough acid and that mechanism doesn't get tripped, then that sphincter stays open and some of the contents of the stomach reflux up into the esophagus. And so my little side hack for that, if you suspect you have low stomach acid, is apple cider vinegar. But do it 10 minutes prior to meals. So don't just do it once in the morning, but do it 10 minutes prior to every meal. And that will prepare the acid in your stomach for digestion. Now, for a lot of people, that's actually not even strong enough, but it's a great place to start in terms of supporting acid. And so, but that acid is critically important for us being able to access those amino acids. Because if you don't fully break down those proteins, a lot of those proteins are going to pass right through and get eliminated out of the body. And so, or even worse, if those proteins don't get broken down and you've got leaky gut, has everybody heard that term before? And you've got leaky gut, now these larger corn protein molecules that should have never been absorbed are now crossing that barrier system and getting into the bloodstream. And that's what creates a lot of food sensitivities for people, is undigested proteins getting into the bloodstream, stimulating an immune response. And so, so a lot of it starts with the acid in the stomach. And so I'm pretty big about that. But primarily, that's where our proteins get digested. Yes?
How much apple cider vinegar should you take?
Yeah, so the question was how much apple cider vinegar, and it's different for everybody, so if you really suspect you have an acid issue, you can start with a tablespoon 10 minutes prior to meals. If you're not quite sure, I would start with a teaspoon. And so just kind of gradually build up. If you feel burning at any time, eat something immediately or, don't do it. But a lot of people, need that extra acid support. So another question, yeah. So the question is ulcerative colitis kind of like a reflux? No, ulcerative colitis happens lower, in the GI system. And so it's typically more an inflammatory issue kind of in lower GI. But what's interesting is a lot of lower GI inflammation, at least in my experience, is related to kind of a low-grade infection in the gut. So kind of either a low-grade fungal infection like Candida, or, I see all the time patients who have low-grade Clostridia infections. And so kind of those low-grade infections create inflammation. And, stomach acid is kind of the first step, for killing any pathogens that you get exposed to in your food. And so I have had a number of patients who've had chronic Candida, who've tried every antifungal under the sun. And when they start supporting their stomach acid, they're able to contain it. So apple cider vinegar, like I said, is a little bit of a weaker acid. You can do something called betaine HCl. It's a supplement. It's a hydrochloric acid attached to a betaine molecule. I always just warn, be careful with that one, because I have had patients that have started that on their own and they built up so high that they gave themselves horrible reflux and they thought they were having a heart attack and ended up in the ER. So just be careful with that one. Do that one with the help of a doctor, because there is a specific way of doing that. And so, but some people, that's their only way of supporting stomach acid. So, but actually the best thing though is to cut out a lot of the grains, because then your body will naturally start building up more acid. Yeah. So cutting out the grains will really help also. That's also why, a lot of people that eat grains get a lot of bloating, because stomach acid, the hormone that releases stomach acid, is also the hormone that triggers the pancreas to release all those enzymes. So remember how I said carbohydrates, fats, and proteins are all further digested by the enzymes that the pancreas releases. Well, when you've got low stomach acid and your stomach's not making the hormone called trypsin is also not stimulating the release of these digestive enzymes. So you're not going to break down your food very well. So you'll end up with undigested material in your stools. You'll end up with bloating. You'll end up with gas, discomfort, GI discomfort. And so, so there's a lot of other symptoms, but a lot of it starts there in the stomach. And so, all right, so these are just a few, like I said, I threw in just a few of some of the more common amino acids, just so you could kind of see the structure compared to the fats and the carbohydrates. And so I apologize, these are a little bit hard to see, but, here's cysteine, so if you've heard of homocysteine, this is part of that. Glutamine, I mentioned, that's needed for healing the gut. Tyrosine, you need that to build dopamine. And so each of these have different molecular structures, and they're all kind of pretty cool. And anybody who's taken organic chemistry knows these structures inside and out, because you have to memorize them. So our best sources of protein, of course, are going to come from, different legumes, meats, different nuts and seeds, eggs. Vegetables can be a good source of protein. If you eat enough, a lot of vegetables, will cover, a lot of our nutritional needs. Like when you think about it, you think how big cows are. Cows are vegetarians. They only eat grass. Now they eat a huge quantity of grass, but they only eat grass. And so, so this idea that we have to get all of our protein or all of our fats, from animal-based sources is just not necessarily true. Now I do believe that we were made to eat, most of us were made to eat, animal protein, and it is a really great source of nutrients when it comes from the right animal. But even if you are eating animal protein, 75% of your diet should still be primarily vegetable based. So no matter if you're a vegetarian or you are a carnivore, most of your diet should still be vegetable based. And you can get a lot of the nutrition you need from those vegetables. Actually, one of my favorite things is when I see little kiddos, and they turn 1 and the mom's like, well, I'm going to start them on cow's milk. And I'm like, well, why? Yeah. And they're like, well, the pediatrician said so. And I'm like, well, why? Well, because they need calcium. Or are they eating, broccoli? Are they eating spinach? Are they still being breastfed? Then they're getting plenty of calcium. And then I also argue back, what about magnesium? And what about selenium? And what about all these other minerals that their body needs? And so having vegetables is going to be your best wide variety source of all these different nutrients. And so, so still that should be our primary focus, is getting as many colorful fruits and vegetables as we can. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the quality of the meat that you're eating, the quality of your protein is so incredibly important. This is a picture of what they call the CAFOs, the concentrated animal feeding operations. And you look at how closely quartered these cows are. They have no room to move. They are literally just sitting there eating, all day long, and disease is rampant, and they're sitting in their own feces, and it's like they're unhappy. And I mean, it's like that's not a good quality source of protein that, is going to give our body, what it needs. These are all chickens, so I don't know if this is too far for you to see, but these are the chickens. And so that's what I'm saying, with the eggs, for chickens that are cage free, all they have to do is open the door. Well, how likely do you think some of these chickens are to make it out the door, just by opening it, 10 minutes a day, so this is where a lot of our conventional meat and protein is coming from. And so I encourage reduce the quantity, but focus on the quality of what you're getting. And so just to kind of summarize, we have here about 10 minutes. I'm going to leave a little bit of time for questions, but just to kind of summarize, the 3 main sources of energy are carbohydrates, which this is, again, a preferred source of energy of the body. We love sugars. We love carbohydrates. It's a quick burn, but the result of that is it's going to signal fat storage in the body. Carbohydrates are best, when combined with fiber to slow absorption. Now, one thing I will note is if you're not trying to burn fat or lose weight, I don't mean to demonize carbohydrates at all, because they are something that our body needs, and we do, enjoy them, especially the complex carbohydrates. But if your goal is weight loss, then I would limit these. And then the other sidebar I will say with carbohydrates is it's very individualized genetically how we respond to insulin. So if you remember that picture where the insulin key fit into that cell membrane, depending on your genetics, you might have less keyholes than everybody else. So your cells might not respond to insulin as well as other people. Or if you're missing certain nutrients, chromium and magnesium, taking chromium and magnesium is like making those cell membranes more sensitive to that insulin. And so, but depending on your genetics, you just might naturally not do well with higher carbohydrates. And so I always tell people that's my story, is I've got a family history of diabetes, strong family history of diabetes, and certain foods like a banana, which is higher glycemic. Most people could probably handle a banana, But for me, that will spike my blood sugar and I'll feel that tank, an hour later. So just kind of be mindful of how certain foods make you feel. And, but kind of let that be your guide when you're in your goals, as far as, figuring out what percentage of each of these different types of foods are best for you. So then fats, as I said, fats are also a preferred source of energy. They are a slow burn and they're going to signal fat burning in the body. Best source of fats is from plant-based sources high in omega-3s. Proteins, not the best source of quick energy in the body. It's a slower burn. They do get turned to sugar in the body. So that's one thing I didn't mention is, it's not going to stimulate the insulin response that carbohydrates do. But if you're really trying to lose weight, doing a whole lot of protein for a lot of people doesn't help them in that endeavor. Which is why on ketogenic, you're doing primarily fats, lesser amount of proteins and sugar. And then proteins, you need good digestion. You need that stomach acid to access those amino acids. And then proteins, quality of proteins, if you're getting an animal source, is of the utmost importance in terms of how your body's going to be able to utilize those proteins. And so, all right, that's Nutrition 101. So thank you guys for being here. And I'll open it up to questions. I might pop on and see online if we have any questions from anybody. Let's see, has she given me any? We do have some questions online. And so, does anybody from the live audience have any questions? And then I'll answer these questions online. Yeah.
For instance, someone wanted to lose weight and they had their gallbladder removed, and with a high-fat diet, you're doing it good for them?
Oh, that's a great question. So the question was if somebody wants to lose weight, but they've had their gallbladder removed. I would say just do it cautiously. I would definitely stick with more of the plant-based, fats, like coconut oil. Coconut oil is going to be easier to break down than compared to some of your animal protein fats, like bacon and stuff like that. And then I would also recommend supporting it with some digestive enzymes. So, if you have a sluggish, pancreas that doesn't make enzymes, or if in that case, you can take enzymes that are specifically high in lipases to help break down fats. And so I wouldn't do the full ketogenic, just because of that, because ketogenic is 60 to 80% fats. I would definitely start smaller and kind of work your way up with that, so start 40, 50% and kind of slowly work up. Any other questions? So questions online is what to do for MS. My sister is almost crawling. Now she has sciatica on top of it. Sounds like a torture victim. I know it's all inflammatory. Yeah, so MS is an autoimmune condition. And so, one of the first things I recommend people do is just to strictly go gluten-free, just because there are a number of cases in the research of people that, whether it was the autoimmune reaction or whether it was true celiac that was causing their symptoms, but even MS diagnosed on an MRI went away going off of gluten. So that would be number one. And then as much as you can get more toward a plant-based, kind of lower carbohydrate diet, which will reduce inflammation, that will help. A diabetic type 2 without a gallbladder should choose what kind of diet? Any diabetic, anybody who's diagnosed as a diabetic, I would recommend doing any sort of dietary changes like this under the help of a doctor, just because, especially if you're on insulin, or you're on any sort of blood sugar regulating medications, that's going to influence, how your body's able to switch. And plus, once you are diagnosed as a diabetic, you've been in this process for quite some time. And so it does take time to retrain the body. It's not impossible. And I think it's worth the investment of working with somebody to do this. But I would definitely work with a doctor. And then what is the website for research food processing? Okay. Yeah, I can send her that information. And plus too, like I said, this is the first class in the series of 4. So the next class is actually, I think, going to be talking about additives in foods and all the different ways in which, we have kind of perversed our food into a form that our body doesn't really recognize. And so what in our food is contributing to leaky gut and contributing to a lot of the inflammation that we have. And so we'll address that more in the next live streamed, usually that afternoon. YouTube will post it up, and so you can go back and watch